The pod fell like a bad joke, dented and whistling, and when it struck the plaza it spat steam and an old man. He looked up at the towers of the galactic capital as if he had woken in the wrong kitchen, asked if anyone had a chair, and then added that if insults were money this city was the richest place he had ever had to bankrupt. He lifted a dull axe as if it were a gavel and the crowd forgot how to laugh. The plaza had been built for spectacles, for coronations and treaties and the kind of speeches that tried to make wars sound tidy. Its flagstones were slabs of pale stone veined with minerals that caught the suns and threw them back as a polite glitter. Around it rose a ring of audience tiers and balconies where ambassadors perched in their native manners, some coiled, some suspended, some balanced on too many legs. It was supposed to be a place that made any visitor feel small. Earth had arrived anyway and sent one man with a battered axe. They had been insulting Earth for hours. The speeches had started dignified and ended with an open season on metaphors. A reptilian envoy whose scales shone like wet coins had declared Earth a nursery throwing rocks at the moon. A creature that resembled a chandelier made of jelly had chimed that humans were melodramatic mammals with a fondness for flags and little else. Laughter rippled and bounced off the glittering stone. The humans on the lower benches did not rise to answer. They had asked to place one representative on the plaza when the convening bell rang noon. The request itself drew snickers. A single representative from a planet so small that its own ocean storms outranked its navies. A single representative from a world that still thought laws were something you could write on paper. The convener, a being wearing a robe woven from fungus that breathed, finally shrugged, gave the formal permission, and waved a staff that meant the floor was Earth's. The sky opened. The pod fell. The plaza inhaled. He stepped out without hurry. He was not tall, and he was not young. He had the kind of age that collects in the edges of eyes and the knuckles of hands, age that had been used for work. His suit was a plain black thing that might have been a uniform in a previous century. The axe he leaned on had a head scarred by time, the steel dulled to a gray that swallowed light instead of throwing it. He squinted into the tiers and hallways and the hanging gardens and fountains, and it all looked like more chores. He wiped a smear of frost from his cheek with the back of his wrist and said he would appreciate water if anyone was feeling generous. The laughter, which had paused the way a hand pauses above a chessboard, tried to resume and then tripped over its own echo. The reptilian envoy hissed into a microphone that shaped sound into meaning. It asked whether Earth had mistaken an execution yard for a council square. It asked whether the old mammal had brought his own grave. The old man tilted his head. He said his name was Jonas Hale and that he did not bring his own graves. He said he left those behind him and preferred the ground clear. A human delegate at the edge of the lower benches, a woman whose suit sat like armor and whose face had been trained not to betray any nation, watched him with the intensity of a gambler watching a last card turn. She had signed the directive that named him the representative. She had done it after listening to a great deal of advice that sounded like doctrine and very little that sounded like wisdom. Earth needed to arrive without missiles or petitions. Earth needed to arrive with a statement that could not be mistranslated. Jonas Hale was that statement. If the galaxy respected anything, it respected endings. A fanfare of wind from the upper vents marked the convener granting first words. Jonas gripped the haft of the axe and walked to the concentric ring etched into the stone that meant speak. He stood inside it and waited for the plaza to settle, and when it did he gave the gentlest nod a neck could give. He thanked the convener for the hospitality, which was a joke that the convener actually appreciated, and he said he was here because Earth had heard a sentence being pronounced upon it without trial. He said he was not a senator, or a scholar, or a soldier. He said he was brought for things that must end in a single stroke. The chandelier being chimed again. It wanted a demonstration. It wanted Earth's representative to prove that he was not simply a prop from a story humans told themselves to sleep better. The crowd roused. Military aides checked their lords for signs, fingers flexed near holsters that contained devices capable of erasing mountains. The convener raised the fungus staff and lowered it in a mince of ceremony. A demonstration, then, but within the codes that kept the plaza from becoming a battlefield. A ceremonial duel, witnessed, with weapons of heritage permitted. The reptilian envoy smiled in a way that showed meat hooks where molars should be and nominated a champion, a gladiator as tall as 3 men with blades that lit themselves from within. Jonas asked again for water. A young functionary with a tray, trembling in joy at being useful, handed him a cup made of pressed leaves. Jonas drank like a farmhand in a harvest field. He handed the cup back with a thank you and, as an afterthought, asked if the ceremonial duel allowed him to keep his own tool. The convener consulted the codes. The axe was ancient. That made it a heritage weapon. It would be allowed. A hush settled that had nothing to do with rules and everything to do with anticipation. It felt like the air before a gallows dawn. The gladiator strode forward, flexing into the ring with an ease that came from a body engineered for violence. Its blades sang. The first overture was always spectacle, and this being had trained to perform it. It twirled arcs that cut dust into glitter and traced amber lines in the air. Jonas let it play. He shifted his weight from heel to heel the way a man in a long line does while waiting to pay for his bread. When the convener lowered the staff again, the gladiator lunged the way comets fall, confident, burning, certain of applause. Jonas moved like a man who had spent a lifetime understanding how not to hurry. He took one step left that carried him just far enough that the first blade cut only his sleeve. He took one step forward and let the other blade pass behind his shoulder. He looked small next to the engineered bulk, and he looked tired. The gladiator corrected, satisfied that it would not need a third swing. Jonas lifted the axe with both hands, not high, not dramatic, simply where it needed to be. He did not chop. He placed it into the path of the second charge as if he were closing a door. The blade met the axe. The axe did not ring. It sank. The haft flexed. Jonas turned his wrists. That was all. The gladiator's neck opened the way a bad seam opens under strain, and its future poured out onto the council's careful stone. Jonas Hales sat on the edge of the cot they had given him, a thing too clean to be trusted and too soft to belong to any prison. The chamber was carved from a pale stone that gave off its own light, and the ceiling shifted colors as if trying to soothe him into complacency. He rubbed his hands across his knees and felt the ache in the joints, the old companion that never let him forget how long he had carried his work. He had swung the axe so many times that his arms sometimes rose in sleep as though still finishing the motions. In the silence he could almost hear the clack of a trapdoor or the creak of a rope, sounds that were his lullabies long after most of the world had turned away from them. He thought of how he had ended up here, in a city of impossible spires where beings shaped like fog and stone discussed matters with the same tone they might use to order lunch. It was not by choice. Jonas had been hidden away after Earth abolished executions. He had lived long enough to see the gallows replaced with gavel and the chair with cells that never opened again. Society declared itself civilized and placed men like him into quiet rooms with pensions and promises that their skills were relics. He had agreed, because what else was there to do when history turned a page and left you behind? But Earth remembered him when the insults began. The ambassadors had not been content to dismiss humanity's armies or mock its technology. They had called Earth weak to its core, a place where justice was theater and punishment was play acting. The insult was not just about power, it was about the idea that humans had no gravity in their souls. That was when someone remembered the last executioner. There were younger men who had fought in wars, women who had commanded fleets, generals who had marched armies across deserts. Yet Jonas Hale had done something rarer. He had been the hand that closed the book on lives with a finality no court could reverse. That was an answer even the most arrogant species would understand. He lay back on the cot and closed his eyes, but the past came anyway. He saw a boy of 19, himself, standing on the platform for the first time, holding an axe that felt heavier than his own body. The condemned man had been taller, broader, filled with rage. Jonas had expected to falter, but when the time came he had brought the axe down as though some other force carried it through him. The silence afterward had been as deep as the plaza's silence today. From that moment forward he had been marked. The courts trusted him, the towns whispered about him, and criminals looked at him as if he were already standing in their final room. As the years passed he became precise. Some called him merciful, though he never thought of himself that way. To him, mercy was leaving no doubt. A man who stumbled, who needed 2 or 3 swings, would be crueler than any torturer. Jonas practiced until his arms knew without thought, until the axe felt like an argument no one dared to continue. When the chair replaced the platform, he adapted, learning switches and wires. When the needle replaced the chair, he adapted again. Yet each time he felt the role shrinking, becoming more clinical, less human, as if society wanted to hide the fact that someone still had to end a life. In the end, when it was outlawed altogether, he was sent home with a plaque and a handshake, as if thanks could fill the emptiness where his purpose had lived. The chamber doors slid open and a functionary entered, a creature whose eyes blinked in opposite rhythms. It offered him food on a tray, something gelatinous that steamed faintly blue. Jonas sniffed and said it smelled like wallpaper paste, then asked if they had bread. The creature did not understand but left the tray anyway. Jonas prodded the food with a fingertip and sighed. He had killed tyrants with less ceremony than this dinner. He left it untouched and leaned back, speaking aloud to no one. He said they wanted a monster, so they would have to settle for an old man. He remembered the day Earth's delegation had come to him. A knock on his cabin door in the hills, a place where he had been left to rot among books and old tools. The woman who stood there had eyes too sharp for a politician. She had told him that Earth had been insulted and needed to send an answer. He had laughed at first, thinking she wanted a speech or a gesture. When she said they wanted him, he asked if she was drunk. But she insisted. The galaxy needed to know that Earth had endings, not just beginnings. He had asked why him, why not some soldier from the old wars? She said soldiers made battles, but executioners made conclusions. He had not answered then, but when she returned the next day he was waiting with his coat on and the axe wrapped in cloth. The memory made him smile faintly, a smile without humor. He had walked into a ship with walls like mirrors and ceilings that bent to fit, and he had not cared. The stars had stretched, folded, rearranged, and he had not cared. He had only thought about whether his axe would seem ridiculous among lasers and cannons. He had decided it did not matter. The axe was not for show. It was what it was, and so was he. Now, lying in this alien chamber, he wondered if Earth had gambled too much. He knew how to kill, but could he do more than that? Could a man who ended lives become a symbol for life itself, for the stubbornness of a planet unwilling to be belittled? He chuckled at the thought, a sound that made the functionary outside peek in nervously before shuffling away. If the galaxy wanted theater, they had picked the wrong man. He did not perform. He finished. He turned over and let the memories run. The faces came, some furious, some resigned, some trembling. He remembered the prayers, the curses, the long looks of men who wanted to live and knew they would not. He carried them all, but not as burdens. They were his ledger, and his task was to balance it. Sometimes he told himself he had been justice, other times only necessity. In the end he was either. He was the hinge that closed doors no one else wanted to close. Perhaps that was why he could stand in a plaza filled with beings from across the stars and not tremble. He had already looked into the eyes of every kind of despair. A reptile with blades or a machine with laws, it made no difference. They all bled or broke or begged the same. The galaxy thought Earth weak because Earth did not flaunt cruelty. But Earth had cruelty enough when it was needed, and Jonas Hale was proof carved in flesh and iron. He rose from the cot, grunting at his knees, and paced the chamber. He swung the axe lightly as if testing the air. Even here, surrounded by walls that shifted colors, he felt more at home with weight in his hands. The blade caught the glow and for a moment looked new again, sharp as a promise. He stopped, leaned on it like a cane, and whispered that if the ambassadors wanted to know what Earth's strength looked like, they would have to keep watching. He was not finished yet. Morning in the capital arrived with a cleanliness that felt rehearsed, as if the city crews had polished not only the stones but the memory of what had bled on them. Jonas woke before the ceiling brightened and sat on the cot with his hands folded over the axe laid across his thighs. The door sighed open and the same functionary shuffled in with a tray that smelled defeated. Jonas thanked it, and asked if bread had been discovered overnight. The functionary blinked in opposite rhythms again, and announced that the council had scheduled a formal trial by strength to settle the question of Earth's place. Jonas nodded as if he had been told the day would include rain. The plaza was fuller than the day before and louder in its efforts to appear calm. News drones floated like patient insects, and attendants in shimmering robes arranged themselves into patterns meant to signal dignity. The convener took the center and read from the codes in a tone that suggested these words had never been used for anything but festivals. The trial by strength would consist of 3 demonstrations under witness and ward. Weapons of heritage permitted. No projectiles. No machines that thought for themselves. Champions from 3 allied species would test the Earth representative. The winner would be the one still standing. Jonas tilted his head, not at the rules but at the word champion, which had always sounded to him like a promise someone else expected you to keep. They sent the exoskeletal first, a being whose body was a cathedral of angles. Plates overlapped like shingles, and between them the muscles flexed in cables that looked like smoked glass. Its weapon was a harpoon grown from its own arm, a shining spike it could lengthen with a twitch. The crowd enjoyed this choice because it allowed them to imagine Jonas skewered like a vegetable. Jonas stepped into the speaking ring, shifted his weight once to let his knees remember honesty, and held the axe low. The exoskeletal feinted with a rattling flourish. Jonas waited. When the harpoon flashed, he stepped into it instead of away, turning his torso so the spike scored his jacket and carved air. His axe flicked up like a doorstop and knocked the harpoon aside. Before the plated joints could reset, he slid the axe head between the second and third plate at the collar, not chopping, only pressing with a torque that made the plate gap yawn. The spike arm went slack. The champion sagged to one knee. Jonas withdrew the blade and the being slumped with a soft clatter, limbs suddenly unstrung. The plaza discovered how much noise quiet could make. The second champion resembled walking pumice, a silicate intelligence whose voice was the sound of sand poured from full hands. The rock body wore grooves tattooed in metals that denoted rank. Its weapon was a hammer grown of its own mass, pulled from its shoulder as if sculpted by an invisible chisel. The crowd approved because they believed rocks would not bleed. Jonas rolled his shoulder and murmured that he had done masonry once, and this looked like a poor mix. The champion advanced with the inevitability of a landslide, each footfall a thesis on weight. Jonas circled, studying the pattern of stress lines that marbled the gray surface. When the hammer fell, he did not try to meet it. He let it hit where he had been, stepped to the inside, and brought the axe down not on the weapon but on the thin seam above the champion's hip where the striations converged. The sound was not metal or meat. It was the small crack of frost lifting from stone at dawn. The champion stiffened. Tiny fractures spidered in an invisible bloom. Jonas struck twice more, inches apart, almost gentle. The hip failed, the mass listed, and the hammer arm could no longer find purchase. The big body settled with a groan like a hill remembering an old name. Jonas stepped back and let it finish remembering. The third was a floater, a translucent sack of gases and nerves suspended over a brace of delicate legs. Along its underside frilled organs pulsed in colors that meant amusement in its language and warning in others. It had no obvious weapon, but everyone knew that the gas sacks could expel jets and acids in patterns that had eaten patrol craft in the last regional war. The crowd grew smug again. "Let us see the axe meet mist," their faces said. Jonas lifted the haft, and pressed his palm to the flat of the head, as if testing a skillet for heat. He paced without haste until he stood upwind from the floater, then waited as if he were lining up clothes on a rope for drying. The floater fanned a frill that meant contempt, and released a test puff. Jonas coughed just once and stepped closer. He swung not to cut but to disturb, the flat of the axe fanning the air in a way that rippled the sack like a pond. He counted in his head. At the 5th count the floater reflexively tightened a sphincter cluster to stabilize. That was the reflex he had memorized. He moved under the sag of the great bladder and jabbed the half-tip into a small, pale node where the nerves braided. The floater spasmed and dropped like a curtain cut free, limbs folding under, gas venting harmlessly in a sigh. Jonas waited out the hiss with the patience of a man who knows stoves sputter before they go cold. The convener tried to speak. It produced a sound like a book shut too quickly. The plaza fumbled for a response that would preserve pride and found none ready. The reptilian envoy finally found its voice and demanded arrest, trial, sanction, explanation in a string so fast the translator clicked. Jonas turned his head lazily and told them that if they wished to arrest him they were welcome to try, but they might want to bring bread to the cell. Laughter stumbled out of a few throats that had not been briefed on the correct emotion. Others hissed that this was murder. The human delegate rose and reminded the council that these were lawful demonstrations under their own codes. If they disliked lawful outcomes, Earth would gladly take that down for their records. The chandelier being suggested the codes were outdated and proposed amendment. The convener found sudden interest in asking the attendants to sweep the ring. After they moved him from the ring, the human delegate intercepted him in a corridor lined with plants that breathed in quiet pulses. Her face carried both relief and worry, a balance he recognized from the eyes of wardens who had escorted him to work on mornings of significance. She said he had done enough for a decade of rhetoric. He said she had not lived through a decade of rhetoric if she thought that. She asked if he had guessed how to unmake each champion or if he had been lucky. He set the axe against his shoulder and told her that Earth had not sent him blind. He said there had been a room with people who knew the insides of things. He said he had studied until his sleeping mind rehearsed joints and seams the way a schoolboy rehearses tables. Word of Jonas Hale traveled through the capital faster than any courier or signal. By dawn every balcony and corridor whispered about the human with the axe. Some said he had killed 3 champions with sorcery hidden in the blade, others claimed he was an illusion Earth had projected to terrify rivals, while the more pragmatic concluded he was simply a murderer who had been sent as a provocation. The stories shifted with every telling, but the core remained the same. The galaxy had seen a man from Earth stand in the plaza and turn inevitability into a weapon. That was enough to rattle the city from its glass towers down to its underground kitchens. Rumors among the guards reached Jonas before the council reconvened. A young soldier assigned outside his chamber told him in a nervous whisper that crews in the barracks were placing bets on whether he was still alive by the end of the week. Jonas chuckled and told him to put his wages on the long odds, since the long odds always paid better if you managed to crawl across them. The soldier smiled despite himself, and quickly remembered to look stern again. Jonas stretched his arms, felt the stiffness of a man used to chopping wood in the cold, and asked if breakfast would once again be wallpaper paste. When he was escorted into the plaza later, the atmosphere felt charged, like iron filings trembling around a magnet. The tiers were full, and this time the ambassadors did not jeer. They studied him with the careful eyes of rulers who had underestimated someone once, and did not intend to repeat the mistake. Jonas walked to the center with the axe resting against his shoulder, as if he were about to mend a fence. The convener lifted the staff and tried to regain dignity, declaring that the council would soon deliberate on Earth's standing. Before the words finished echoing, voices erupted across the tiers. Some demanded Earth be recognized as sovereign immediately, others shouted that Earth must be banned before its violence infected the stars. Jonas said nothing. He let the noise tumble and crack, because silence had always been his craft. When the convener finally banged the staff hard enough to jar the ears of even the deafest attendant, Jonas simply cleared his throat. The effect was enough to still the immediate tears, though he offered no speech. He only asked for bread again. That single request scattered the tension with nervous laughter and muttering. The convener stared at him, unable to tell if the man was mocking them or simply hungry. Jonas knew the answer did not matter. While the debates rolled on above, plans were being made in darker corners. A faction of ambassadors, threatened by the fear he inspired, concluded that the human must not live to see another dawn. They gathered in chambers lined with metallic vines that shielded sound, and they whispered of assassins. They hired a cadre of specialists trained in poisons and blades designed to pierce carapace and hide, convinced that against one frail mammal the task would be trivial. Their mistake was believing Jonas would not expect them. He was led back to his chamber, as the city's false dusk lowered across the spires. He sat on the cot, axe across his knees, and listened to the building breathe. The air systems hummed differently when weight pressed against ducts. The silence of guards outside carried a tension too practiced. Jonas rested his eyes and waited, the way he had waited behind a curtain for a prisoner to mount the steps, steady in the knowledge that death was on schedule. When the assassins came, they moved like shadows poured into flesh, 3 of them in suits that bent light. The first lunged from the left with a blade that glowed faint green. Jonas shifted his body just enough to let the blade miss ribs and catch cloth. The axe came up with no rush, just certainty, and split the attacker's mask so neatly the body did not realize it had died until the knees gave way. The second tried from behind with a wire meant to slice his throat. Jonas stepped forward, yanked the slack with one arm, and buried the axe backward through space as naturally as drawing a curtain. The third froze, realizing the mistake too late, then tried to retreat. Jonas walked after him, calm as ever, and cornered the assassin by the pale wall. He pressed the axe head under the creature's chin until its own pulse betrayed panic. Jonas told the assassin he did not fight. He finished. He asked who had sent them. The assassin refused, shivering with the kind of terror only those who kill for hire understand when death is suddenly their employer. Jonas withdrew the axe with a sigh, letting the being collapse. He left the body alive but ruined, because sometimes survival carried the sharper punishment. Then he sat again on the cot and wiped the blade with a cloth that had once been white. The guards outside burst in late, trying to appear as though they had not been ordered to look the other way. Jonas only asked if they had bread yet. By morning the rumor of the failed assassination had spread as quickly as the rumor of his first duel. Ambassadors argued more furiously than before. Some claimed the attempt proved Earth had enemies too afraid to challenge it in the open. Others whispered that Jonas had orchestrated the attack himself to deepen the fear. The truth mattered less than the atmosphere it created. Every corridor hummed with speculation. Jonas had become not just a man but a shadow cast over every calculation. Meanwhile, small signs of respect began to appear. A cluster of envoys from minor worlds approached him in the garden where he sometimes sat. They asked if he truly had ended kings on his world. He told them yes, though kings bled no different than anyone else. One of them, a delicate insectoid, asked why he had never faltered. Jonas shrugged and said faltering only prolongs cruelty, and mercy is often a clean cut. The words traveled faster than he expected, retold as legend, shaping him into something larger than a man with a dull axe. In quieter halls, his humor unsettled them most. When presented with alien delicacies, he spat them out with muttered lines that made attendants stifle laughter. When a pompous ambassador tried to intimidate him with titles, Jonas asked if any of them came with a bakery attached. His dry wit cut through ceremony in a way more devastating than blades, for no one could decide if he was mocking the galaxy or simply too blunt to care. The human delegate observed all this with a mixture of awe and dread. She had chosen him as Earth's symbol, but symbols could slip from the hands that forged them. By the third night, whispers of rebellion began to surface. Delegations from oppressed colonies sent quiet feelers toward Jonas, asking if Earth's executioner might lend his weight to their causes. To them he was not only an answer to insults, but a possible end to tyrants who had sat on thrones for too long. Jonas listened with the patience of a man who knew desperation when he heard it. He did not promise anything. He simply told them that every ruler ended eventually, and how quickly depended on who swung the axe. By mid-morning the convener gathered the council in a ring that gleamed like a quiet threat. The tiers were full of faces trying to look carved from certainty while their eyes betrayed arithmetic. Jonas stood in the speaking circle with the axe balanced across his palms like a scale. The human delegate waited at the edge of the ring, posture straight, voice ready. When the convener raised the breathing staff, she stepped forward and delivered what Earth called the bargain. Earth would accept equal standing and submit to every code the Council claimed to honor. Earth would send no fleet and seek no favor. In return, Earth asked recognition that mockery was not a policy, and that sovereignty meant more than the right to be insulted politely. Where the codes failed, where cruelty held power under ceremonial names, Earth offered a last resort. Send for Jonas Hale not as a soldier but as a judge. Invite him by majority or by plea from those without voices, and he would come to end what would not end any other way. Otherwise he would leave his axe in its cloth and go home. The words spread through the plaza with the strange hush that follows a bell. Jonas added little. He told them he had no interest in travel unless in speeches. He told them he liked the idea of retiring again, and that he would settle happily for bread and a quiet morning if they accepted the bargain. A few laughed in spite of themselves. Others stared as though daring themselves not to. He finished with a plain truth that came from a life of endings. If the council refused and persisted in calling Earth a planet of children with toys, he would begin his work here, among the ambassadors who had made themselves at home inside those words. He said he did not hunt. He said he enforced conclusions. The debate erupted and split along lines that no one had drawn yet everyone felt. One tier thundered that this was elegant, a way to honor codes without parading armies. A second spat that it was extortion in a polite suit, the threat of an axe wrapped in ceremony. A third tried to frame it as precedent, and then realized with a shiver that precedent was the one thing they feared more than surprise. The convener tried to keep order and failed. The votes were not ready. Alliances that had looked carved from stone yesterday now moved like water. In the corridors under the tiers, oppressed delegations moved closer to Earth's corner, as if drawn by gravity. A matriarch from a chain of salt moons asked the human delegate whether petitioners would be heard in the open, or only in the dark. A scholar whose people had lived under a hereditary admiral for 5 generations offered documents detailing the admiral's small cruel decrees and asked if a ledger of petty evils counted as proof. Jonas listened and said that the smallest cruelty added weight faster than the large ones because it trained the soul to stoop. The words traveled among them like a lantern passed down a rope. Not everyone came from below. In a green chamber with a floor that shifted like a slow tide, a figure waited for Jonas after the morning session. She introduced herself without titles, though the cut of her robe and the set of her jaw betrayed a lineage that knew exactly where power sat on any given day. She told Jonas quietly that she had seen the higher order for the assassins and that the faction behind it had not stopped with failure. Something older than the city had been moved out of the forbidden vaults beneath the plaza. She had listened through a vent and heard a word no one used in public anymore, a word that meant a beast built by hands that had since been punished by treaties. Jonas thanked her with his small earnest nod. He asked whether the creature smelled bread. She blinked, then almost smiled, then did not. He did not press. He handed the information to the human delegate, who absorbed it the way a dam takes a new river, with no drama and enormous force. She sent a message to security that would be received and filed and ignored. The faction had friends in most places that mattered, and in a few places that liked to pretend they did not. At noon the convener proposed a compromise. Before any vote on Earth standing, the council would test the bargain in a controlled matter, a dispute small enough to be contained but sharp enough to cut through pretense. 2 minor worlds had been locked in a resource feud for years, and every mediation had failed because both sides preferred pride to water. Let Jonas judge them under witness without raising his axe. If he could end the feud by afternoon, the council would consider Earth's proposal with less fear. If he failed, Earth would be asked to take its relic and leave. The council thought this clever. Jonas called it decent work. They brought the 2 delegations to the ring and gave them time to recite offenses in the approved forms. Jonas listened without hurry. He asked each a handful of questions that would have been naive if asked by anyone else, questions about who actually drank the water and who actually dug the wells and who actually bled when skirmishers tested the border. Then he did a thing no one expected. He told the convener to dim the lights and asked the drones to show the city the faces of the farmers and children on both worlds who would be dead in a decade if nothing changed. He had asked the human delegate for those faces the night before, because he knew that the only arithmetic that matters is the kind that counts children. The images washed over the tiers and left quiet behind them that was not ceremonial at all. Then he made the simplest proposal any judge has ever made. Each world would share the aquifer for a number of seasons equal to the years of war it had fought, and the first to break the terms would face something more final than an embargo. The delegations looked at the images and then at the axe and then at the convener, and they agreed with a haste that embarrassed them. For an hour the plaza felt almost clean. It felt as if this galaxy might prefer sense to theater if given the option. The human delegate leaned near Jonas and whispered that this was the victory Earth needed. He told her victory was only a word that meant the problem had agreed to sleep for a moment. He kept his eyes on the tiers, where a handful of ambassadors were discovering that their plan required spectacle to drown out the smell of compromise. They did not unleash the beast at night, when fear would have been easy. They waited until the council called for a vote and the plaza was at its fullest, when denial would be impossible and panic contagious. The statue at the northern rim of the ring had stood since before the last Great War, a memorial to a city that had survived the greed of its own inventors. As the convener raised the staff and the drones tightened their circles, the statue cracked along seams that had been hidden for a century. Stones sloughed off in slabs to reveal a shape inside that was not art at all. It was a chassis the size of a small building, wrapped in tissues grown from patents no one admitted owning. Its eyes opened without pupils. It drank the air and decided to hate it. The beast's roar swallowed the plaza, a sound so vast it seemed to drag the air out of lungs and shake it into dust. Delegates scattered from their tiers, robes trailing like broken banners, while guards loosed bolts of light that splashed harmlessly across the thing's armored hide. Jonas did not move at first. He watched the creature lumber forward on legs that bent with a grotesque mimicry of life, each step cracking the ancient stones beneath. He studied its rhythm, the uneven way the torso swayed, the vulnerable hitch that betrayed joints older than their flesh. Around him panic grew into chaos, voices shouting in 100 tongues, drones buzzing with frantic hunger for spectacle. But Jonas only tightened his grip on the axe and muttered that the galaxy had never built anything it didn't want someone else to finish. The beast lunged with a suddenness that made the towers shiver. Its massive forelimbs smashed into the plaza ring, scattering attendants like dolls. Jonas slipped sideways with no more urgency than a man stepping away from a passing cart. The limb crushed stone where he had stood, and shards flew like hail across the tiers. He pivoted and swung the axe not at the limb itself but at the seam just above the joint, a strike that looked small against the enormity of the monster. Yet the blade bit, a whisper of dull steel that tore open a fissure in the lattice. The beast bellowed, more surprised than wounded, and the plaza reeled with its pain. Jonas stepped back, calm as ever, letting the thing reel. He had no illusions. This was no gladiator trained to entertain, no assassin relying on stealth. This was a machine of old wars, grown from a forgotten arrogance, and it would not tire. If it bled fire. He braced himself as the jaws irised open and exhaled a torrent that vaporized railings and boiled fountains into steam. Heat slapped him across the face, but he had stepped left just enough that the firestorm missed. He felt the sweat sting his eyes and the taste of ash coat his tongue. He pressed forward again, each step measured, the axe rising like the slow tick of a clock. Above, ambassadors screamed for evacuation. Some shouted to blame Earth immediately, others begged the convener to restore the wards, but the wards remained dead. The faction that had loosed the beast stayed hidden in their alcove, hoping panic would mask their crime. The human delegate stood her ground near the ring, unable to intervene, forced to watch the man she had sent as symbol become once more the worker of endings. She saw no fear on his face, only the stubborn weariness of someone who had already outlived his purpose once, and would see it through again. The beast swept at him with both limbs, a motion that would have flattened houses. Jonas ducked into the swing, closer rather than farther, so the limbs collided behind him. Stones shook, dust rose, and for a moment the monster tangled itself. He used that pause to drive the axe upward in a heavy arc into the chest seam he had marked. The haft shuddered in his hands as the head sank deep. Sparks and fluid erupted in equal measure, spattering his jacket. The beast screamed, staggering back, tearing the weapon from his grip as it thrashed. For the first time since his arrival, Jonas was without the axe. Gasps rippled across the tiers. Some believed it finished. The beast staggered upright, the axe buried in its chest, glowing faintly as the thing's systems fought against the intrusion. Jonas wiped blood and oil from his cheek with the back of his hand. He walked after it, unhurried, the way he had always walked after men whose knees had already buckled. He waited for the creature to steady, then leapt and seized the haft with both hands, hanging like a farmer pulling down stubborn wood. He twisted. The seam groaned and split further. The beast convulsed, swiping blindly, smashing pillars and sending a drone spiraling into fire. Jonas did not release his grip. He pulled with the inevitability of gravity until the axe tore free in a shower of flame and ichor. The monster stumbled, its chest torn open, but it did not fall. It roared again and unleashed another blast that turned part of the plaza into a crater. Jonas rolled across the stone, his body heavy with age, his knees shrieking protest, but he came up on one hand and rose again. Blood trickled from his arm where a shard had found him. He ignored it, as he had ignored every cut that had tried to slow him in a career of final blows. He advanced again, lifting the axe as if it weighed nothing more than a broom. The crowd could not understand how a man of flesh could face that storm. But Jonas knew storms always spent themselves. The beast drew itself taller, sails flaring like banners of bone and iron. It raised its head to crush him under its full weight. Jonas stepped in close, closer than sanity allowed, and swung with everything that remained in his shoulders. The axe buried itself at the base of the skull, deep into the junction where nerve and circuit converged. He twisted once more, a simple finishing motion he had practiced his whole life. The roar caught in the monster's throat, turned into a choking gurgle, and then ceased. The sails collapsed inward. The massive body shook once, then toppled, crashing into the plaza with a weight that cracked stone for 100 meters. Dust and smoke billowed up like a funeral pyre. Jonas staggered back, coughing, his legs trembling but his eyes clear. He leaned on the axe, slick with fire and fluid, and stared at the corpse until he was certain it would not rise again. The plaza was silent except for the settling rubble. Ambassadors who had been screaming now whispered like children. The convener clutched the staff with white knuckles, unable to form a sentence. The human delegate walked slowly toward Jonas, her face pale, her expression one of awe and terror mixed. He looked at her, and said simply that it was finished. Then he turned to the tears, raising his voice without shouting, letting the silence carry it. He told them that endings had come to their city, and not by accident. He pointed the axe toward the section where those who had plotted still hid. He said one day he would come for them, not as Earth's envoy but as their consequence. He told the council that this was what Earth had offered, the clean close to cruelty when no other argument remained. He told them they could accept sovereignty now or spend their nights wondering if the axe would fall in their sleep. The words sank into the plaza like stones into deep water. No one laughed. No one jeered. The convener finally lifted the staff with a trembling hand and declared Earth recognized, equal among sovereigns. Delegates who would have argued for weeks before gave assent within breaths. Even those who hated Earth most felt relief that Jonas had ended the beast, and fear that he might decide they deserved the same fate if they lingered in defiance. Later, when the plaza emptied and the bodies of the assassin's plot were dragged from hiding, Jonas sat on a bench with the axe across his knees. The human delegate sat beside him. She asked if he was satisfied. He shook his head and said satisfaction was for men who built, not men who ended. She asked what he wanted then. He said bread and silence. She laughed, a weary sound, and told him that after today no silence would follow him again.